There's two things in particular that they like to do, and both of them is sing and dance and pitch a little woo. Everybody's in for one swell time around Nacogdoches across the county line.
We get this idea that we're totally poisoned by the movies that I grew up with. The Hollywood movies is like your concept of what the way people are, Native Americans in particular, is so far off course. And they were as diverse as we are now. The Cherokees, you had Cherokee planters who were like uppity up as the highest white planters that dressed in tuxedos and could speak great English and sent their kids to college. And then they had Native Americans that were still living in the woods, and the banjo came from the valleys, came from slaves. So one of the things I think always strikes me as interesting in after having a big look back in time and music, I got into this origin of the banjo and origin of music thing a long time ago, and in the end, after studying or reading or all the things I found out, I realized how modern music of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and on to now was completely based on this and a fiddle. And I say this, I mean a gourd banjo for starters. And the first gourd banjos were literally a pole through a gourd with a hide head over it, strings tied on up to the pole. I honestly don't know exactly how they always tuned these things. They had some pegs on them. They usually they would have a halfway up string like a fifth string tied, but usually there were four. Anyway, I won't get too much into that. Thomas Jefferson's plantation, he noted that the banjo was the main instrument of the slaves. Slaves played fiddles too, and I've always heard this story. I believe it's true. Thomas Jefferson had a very little known brother named Randall that played fiddle also. That Thomas Jefferson was a fiddler, and he played. I think he varied from fiddle music to classical music, which a lot of people did back then. They might play. It wasn't such a distinct line always. And anyway, his brother was known to stay up all night drinking and playing music with the slaves, and so this mingling with the slaves was very much like white guys in the 20th century wanting to play Delta blues and stuff. It was the same kind of thing. And I mean, they were fascinated by the music, and they were taught, and they firsthand in most cases. And then that spawned a whole new crazy thing, which got out of hand in a lot of ways. The minstrel music, which in a lot of ways was derogatory and mean and all that. We can look back now, but it wasn't always meant that way at all. Just like guys would play blues now, a lot of them was just sincerely in admiration, and that's why they did it. I mean, you don't learn to do all this without that. And that hit a huge craze in the 1840s. The first actual bands, the minstrel music, white guys playing banjos, goes back to the late 1700s. Native Americans were also playing. Native Americans were playing fiddle as well. Very early, back to the 1600s, there's records of Cherokees playing Irish fiddle tunes and dancing Irish steps because they intermarried, and that happened. It just it was part of the culture. On the Native American part too, the form of tunes, I don't know whether this is getting too deep into things or not, but the form of a lot of fiddle tunes, starting high to low, was thought to come from Native Americans. There's records Also, I said earlier about the records of Cherokees playing Celtic style, British Isles fiddle tunes, Irish fiddle tunes back in the 1600s. That tradition, that was a stronger thing than you might think. I know that the records during the Trail of Tears, there's records of them leaving fiddles behind or taking fiddles with them. There's one song called the Green River March that was supposedly made up by Native Americans on that route. In fact, I used to play that tune. I got the record, my learning about that came from a man who was of Cherokee descent, and it was passed down through his family, and that's what his great-grandmother or whatever said, and she played the fiddle, and she said that this is one that they made up along the way. So, and it very much sounds like an Irish tune. I mean, it's like all those tunes, all fiddle tunes are alike, but a little bit different, you know, as they say, like all music, really. But it really had the hallmarks of Bonaparte Crossing the Rhine, which is a pretty well-known fiddle tune. Not Bonaparte's Retreat, but Bonaparte Crossing the Rhine, which is a march. Anyway, this is one of the ways, the other ways that music started to grow, and it was not growing so much in the mountains at the time. We always give all this credit to Appalachians. That's partly true, but that's kind of a latter day thing. In reality, these tunes were being passed, fiddle tunes. It was the music of the day, and some of them were of the minstrel sort, and some of them were the Scotch-Irish tunes. They were mixing around. So that's one way things began to mix together, and styles, even of fiddle, started mixing between black and white. And but the great thing, as you really see about the banjo happening, was the rhythmic structure of the music started taking hold. These beats, syncopations, the strums, and there were very often there was some form of drum with African American music. It was not usually just a banjo. It became bones and ham bone, what they call, where you slap a body. It became those partially because in a lot of slave owning areas, there were slave owners were afraid that the drums were signals between plantations for slave uprisings and stuff, so they outlawed them. And another interesting spreader of music, of course, was steamboat travel. A lot of music on steamboats, and there's plenty of records of that. Another spreader of music was circuses and such. I didn't ever have any idea. I was talking to my friend Jack here yesterday about that this fiddle tune, that it came from a German dwarf in the late 1800s who wrote it for a circus dancer. And that Ricketts hornpipe is another one that was written like that. And then leading back, when I was talking earlier about the 12 Years a Slave, I think that's documented in the movie, or they talk about it in the movie, but the whole idea that he was the character in that, Noah, was a very good violin/fiddle player, and he was hired by the circus, and that's what got him kidnapped. That's how he ended up as a slave.
I was raised in East Texas. I've lived here practically all of my life. I'm 83 years old, and I remember a lot of things that I did and saw, but The earliest entertainment that I remember for country folks, I was raised in the country, was the tent show and the medicine show. Now, those two things would draw a crowd.
I lived at Sackle, and my dad had a meat market there, and out in front of the meat market, in front of the other stores, and the stores on the west side, there was a vacant spot out there, and that's where the medicine show is usually located. They'd come in there in these trucks, panel-like things with a top on them, and looked like what we call today a delivery truck. And they had on one side, they had a big table, actually what it was a platform, and they just folded it over and had legs on it, and they'd get up on that platform and perform their little show.
It usually started with some sort of a musical entertainment. Now, it may be a single banjo, it might have been a fiddler. If it was one of the better known medicine shows, they might have a fiddle and a banjo, and even sometime a guitar.
As I said earlier, he had a one-man band. From time to time, he would either have a mandolin, a guitar, and he played harmonica. He had a bass drum.
It's all string music, except if they had an artist that was performing, and he might play a trombone or a trumpet or a cornet or something, but it wanted to be loud. I noticed that they played and sang as loud as they could, no matter how close they were to the audience, because that was to draw people in from the outskirts who didn't know whether they wanted to come to the show or not.
As you see, as this music kept going on, post-slavery, then we took a new direction, and of course, had the birth of ragtime piano. This is a move to sophistication, and Scott Joplin and many others were playing music that came from old banjo tunes and stuff. They were rags because they were pieces of different tunes being put together and form old melodies. Scott Joplin's mother played the banjo. Scott Joplin played the mandolin before he played, I don't know if he already was before he played the mandolin, but before he played the piano, but he taught mandolin lessons. And he actually wrote the Entertainer in honor of a group of mandolin players, a little mandolin orchestra thing that he saw. So the string music was part of his culture. In the ragtime culture is just undeniably that step before jazz. The blues, these early banjos, the slide sound was there. But I've had banjos come in here from my shop that were manufactured banjos, which meant, usually late 19th century. And they had pulled all the frets out and put a piece of metal or bone on the first five because they wanted that slide sound. And they liked to match it with a fiddle, and they still had this thing from way back from all that. So you can see this, how the transfer, it's really apparent. And I you can take that lightly, but if you really go back and look at the music, it's just solid as a rock. That's where it all came from, and it just kept progressing. As music all does, it never stays the same.
And it has the sign that goes air conditioning. And back then, that was really important because most places didn't have air. We didn't. God, I hope that isn't on camera.
That's okay.
But it's a guy from Big Sandy, which is just down the road. And he always claimed, I think he was from Gladewater, was Henry, Texas Ragtime Thomas. And so I found out that he used to just wander and play. He was one of the, like Robert Johnson. And in some ways, I think he may have been just as influential, although he hasn't gotten good press because he didn't have the Sold My Soul to the Devil story. But he was a guy that was really ahead of Johnson, that was around before him, but he would come through Gladewater, Big Sandy, all these places. And he would ride the train and play on the train, and as a black man being on the train, that's how they let him go. That's how he got his ride. And he was a guy that nobody knew much about. And one reason there's nothing about him, I think, was neglect of these early musicians, especially black musicians, but also because nobody knew much about him. He did some recordings in Chicago, and there's some ads for this album that he made. Outside of that, there's not much, but his songs have been done by Canned Heat, Bob Dylan, you name it. But that's East Texas influence. But he had these pipes that he had in the corner of his mouth, little bitty pipes, and he would blow and sing and play at the same time, which was a trademark of Henry Thomas. And that they were called pan pipes by some, quills, depending, and they were often made by a lot of black performers out of Kane, things like that, because they were easy to construct. But if you hear that opening to Canned Heat, I'm going up country, it's got the same sound. Back in the 50s in particular, what a lot of people don't realize, like for Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Ray Price, and numerous people who became well-known and influenced music, is that Gladewater was a place where they got the opportunity to do the music they were doing and to get better known. I think Gladewater was probably just as important to Elvis's career as Louisiana Hayride and Sun Records. It might be number 3, but it would be Sun, Hayride, Gladewater. But Gladewater's kind of got lost in the mist, because what they used to do is they would bring Elvis in to play in a number of places. All of these people played at different places, but one thing is they had Tom Perryman was a disc jockey, and there was a radio station in Gladewater. I don't remember its call sign right now, but all of these people played live on the radio. So that meant when I was a kid, I would hear that station. I had no idea they were just down the road from me, because Elvis wasn't Elvis then. And, they were prominent in that they were doing music that people were listening to, but they had not become legends. But this particular radio station is where those people performed live, and they got that opportunity because of Tom Perryman. Elvis used to stay in people's houses, and visit with them. In fact, there's a museum in Gladewater that's just been recently established that has a whole section devoted to East Texas music, Gladewater, obviously in particular. And I'm in the museum too for not that, but for other stuff. But this whole section is with Johnny Cash, especially Elvis. They show pictures of Elvis sitting with families eating and out at some little kind of resort place out by the lake that I've been to too when I was growing up. It was still there. I don't know about now, but he was very much a everyday guy in one way, and then yet he was unique in this other way, because he was becoming a star, and he was dragging along a lot of other people. And then there were people like Cash that were making their own mark, and people like Jerry Lee Lewis, and again, Ray Price. It wasn't just what you think of as rockabilly people, but Bob Luman. I don't know if Bob Luman played on the radio station, but they all played in that area. And the interesting thing is there's still the motel there where Elvis and Johnny and all this, and they still have the card where Elvis signed in at the hotel or motel. But so many of those people, had it not been for Gladewater, and had it not been for Tom Perryman, had it not been for that radio station where he was a disc jockey as well as a promoter of music, they would have never made it. In fact, Tom Perryman helped those people, by finding them places to stay, getting them gigs where they could make money. And Elvis used to play out at the Mint Club, which was a honky-tonk, really, essentially what it was, which they've moved from one side of the road to the other, though they don't have any kind of dedication or anything that I'm aware of. And the music from East Texas and Gladewater as well has been so influential that people listen to it every day, and they don't know they're listening to Gladewater vibes, but they are, or East Texas vibes, like Big Sandy.
Well, I'm John Early with Hickory Hill.
Okay. What's your
And I'm Don Eves. I'm the banjo player.
Yes, we met Don in 1979 in the valley of Kerrville, Texas, at the Kerrville Bluegrass Festival. And we formed a band, and me and a couple of other guys were there, and we formed the band after we got back to Tyler, where Don was living and we were living at the time. And been going ever since. We kind of have different backgrounds as far as what influenced us, but of course we all love all of it, you know. And that our music kind of shows in that, I think. We're a cross between the tradition and then kind of the we're not progressive, I don't think, but pure straight country maybe, you know, pure. It was a who's who of bluegrass. I mean, everybody. A good friend of ours out of Houston, Rick Garner, was a photographer back then, and he has some very good classic bluegrass pictures, and a whole lot from that festival.
I remember well, Hot Rise was there.
Oh yeah, Jethro Burns was there. Sam Bush and the Newgrass Revival was there. Yeah, it was a great festival for Nacogdoches. Been doing it now. This will be our 42nd year, so why quit? You know, why quit now?
Well, I moved to Nacogdoches because I met this gal going to SFA in San Angelo in an SDS rally. And she invited me to NAC. And I came down one weekend and picked her up at Gibbs Hall, and then we went out and picked mushrooms. And so when I got back after the weekend to Angelo State, my roommate said, "How'd it go?" And I said, "It went really good. I'm transferring to SFA." So that put me here in the early 70s. And music-wise, the scene here, there wasn't anything outside of a party mix to begin with. And I was invited to go to a house party up on the hill where Highway 7 and 21 split. And the hippie softball team, the Sleazy Sluggers, were hosting the party. So, you know, they had some kegs out there, and a band got up on the porch and started cranking it. And, you know, everybody's enjoying themselves, and then the police came and went up and told them to tone it down, and they left. And my friend Keith Wyberny, the first time I met him, I said, "Well, I guess that's the end of that." And he said, "No, there's no party worth mentioning in NAC unless the cops come 3 times. So, cops came the second time. Told them to dial it down. That's it, you know. They left. You know, he looked at me and winked and said, "That's 2. 30 minutes later, they started playing again. The cops came, walked up on the porch and arrested the guitar player. And the policeman leaned into the microphone and said, "Anybody here play guitar? Anybody else knows how to play guitar? All right, I think we're done." Anyway, the conversation started at some point because, you know, we were having to go far afield to hear music and stuff, and then somebody pointed out that what we needed was some private clubs that could bring in music and get a cabaret license to, you know, for music, dancing, whatever. So a campus-wide crusade to get everybody to register to vote in Nacogdoches. And everybody, you know, went on and did their thing. And so we had enough signatures on a petition to get that on the ballot to vote on the private club in Nacogdoches. The city council moved the voting date into the summer when school was out. So we hired an attorney and got it put back, you know, on the ballot during the semester, and it passed overwhelmingly. So that was the first step. That brought in the Hole in the Wall, the Party Center, and the Caravan Club The Caravan Club was primarily country music, but both the Party Center and the Hole in the Wall were just popular, you know, whatever the flavor of the day. The Hole in the Wall, to their credit, they got Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee to play. They got Gatemouth Brown to play. Clifton Chenier played there one time. So we were in hog heaven as far as, you know, finally getting some music to come to Nac and being able to go and see live music. Yeah.
Well, come on, baby, let's do that twist. Come on, baby.
We certainly didn't invent have a band come and play in the woods. My generation, people were doing it for years before us. You might want to talk to Wally Knight. I mean, used to bring the big boys to town, and that was, you know, they were like this legendary Texas punk band. But what's cool is Randy Biscuit Turner, the lead singer for that. He was from Gladewater, and he was, you know, this weird young gay dude who went to the big city of Austin and found his tribe, followed his arrow, and ended up becoming one of the most influential, you know, Texas music artists of all time. They always, every time they would end their show, he'd yell, "Go start your own band," and there were tons and tons of bands that took his advice and went and did that, you know. So I was always super proud to know that he was from Gladewater.
Well, Randy Biscuit Turner was just Randy Turner when I was a kid, and we were all part of a group of people who had long hair. He was older than me. He was a little bit ahead of me by a year or two. I don't remember exactly. And he was always unique. He was an artist. He was just a different kind of guy for Gladewater, Texas, you know. And but he later formed a group in Austin called the Big Boys, and he was their lead singer. And so there's another guy from Gladewater right there.
The new wave phase came in. Fort Worth Cats was one of the bands that played back in the day. And the Fort Worth Cats announced a show at Clubfoot in Austin with the Big Boys. So a bunch of us from Nac, a bunch of people, friends from Fort Worth, all went down there to see them. Super impressed with both bands. But after the show, Biscuit, Randy Turner, came up and invited us, said, "Y'all won't be strangers, come to my house," you know. So after their last set and everything, we followed Randy down South Lamar up into this neighborhood and got out, and we all parked and started walking up to this house and got up on the porch and opened the door. In the living room of the house, all the walls and the ceiling were painted pink. And hanging from the ceiling of the living room were arguably 40 or 50 Barbie dolls hanging from nooses with their, you know, hands tied behind their back. And everybody just stopped. Like, you know, oh my God, you know, is this the beginning of a Texas Chainsaw? You know, what are we stepping into? But, you know, the more I knew about Biscuit, you know, that's just the way he rolled. There was a group here called the Naco Native Social Club that ponied up money back in the day, kind of a on the QT membership, and hired bands to come and play. I think 2 or 3 of those were at Sacagawea Studios out east of town. But one of them that was iconic that the Big Boys played was at Barnes Lake, out there off of 205 on the way to Cushing. And it was an international paper on the lake, but you know, we had a couple people in our group that had keys to the gate to the lake. So once again, we rented a flatbed trailer for the band to play on, and everybody came out there, and it was a great swimming hole because it's spring-fed water. So Big Boy showed up, did this blistering set. Biscuit showed up, shaved head, wearing a wedding dress. You know, so people were taking turns dancing on, you know, listening to the Big Boys, and then going down to the dock and skinny dipping in the lake to cool off, because this was like June, so it's quite hot, quite humid. And then the second set that they did, all the vegetation from the band had been pounded down to red dirt, and this cloud of waist high, just this brown dirt mist rose up, you know, and everybody was sweating like dogs, so everybody was coated with that, went back down to the lake and stuff. And it finally went to the level of people just wearing their shoes, you know, just leaving their clothes on the dock by the lake and wearing their shoes to come up and dance to the big boys. Yeah, but good time was had by all. Yeah, yeah.
I think one of the last things that he did before he passed away was had an art show here with all these students. I think Moses had some stuff going too.
And then years later, the first outsider party that was in Nacogdoches was Wally and the Moses Biscuit, that we got Randy up here, and then Moses, our crazy, you know, painter, to do a show here, and that was great. Yeah. Also, Music Line, back in the day, the Hole in the Wall became the Crossroads, and started getting bands that were kind of the flavor of the day. Stevie Ray Vaughan, you know, came.
Well, Stevie Ray seemed like he kind of halfway belonged to Nacogdoches, because even as a kid, I remember when he would play over. I never saw him at Crossroads. I saw him later at the music hall in Houston. But I heard him at Crossroads. He was so damn loud. You always knew when Stevie Ray was playing, because he'd be over there warming up, doing sound check in the afternoon, and you could hear it halfway across the campus at SFA. I would be up at the campus with my dad, because my dad was a professor then, and I would be up there riding bikes around and stuff, and you would hear and it was like, Stevie's here. People knew that Stevie Ray played there, and this was before he made it big. People knew, because he played here repeatedly, and everybody knew he was going to be big. That's one of those guys. I saw other bands play there that made it really big and shocked us all by, oh my God, they hit the charts. And I won't name names, Deep Blue something, but Stevie Ray, everybody knew that he was going to be big.
You know, Crossroads at the time was a very storied club, and it's weird now, because to go back to, you know, if you go to flashbacks and you look across the street, there's this parking lot, and it doesn't look very big, and that's where Crossroads used to be, and that's where all these bands played and all this crazy stuff happened. And it just doesn't seem like it's big enough, because it had this area you walk into, and there were pool tables and bathrooms, and then there was a middle area that it was open air, didn't have a roof, and that was the beer garden. And so every Friday afternoon there would be lots of bands, acoustic cover bands would play out there, and Five's the Crowd, and I think JC and those guys, I can't remember their names, but lots of different bands, and that would be like your all Friday afternoon, you know, good time, singing along music. And then the next side over there was the bar and the stage, and then other, you know, other bands would play there at night. And everyone talks about, you know, Steve Ray Vaughan played there a lot. Everyone saw him play there. I don't know how many people actually did, but you know, and the Killer Bees, I think, were another big reggae band that played there a lot, that everyone liked to tell stories to. I was too young to know all this, but so it was like it was a legendary place. I was always more impressed that like the Judys played there, I think, than Steve Ray Vaughan, just because I liked them better. But you know, it had stories, it had a history, and so it was cool for us to get to play there. We had a lot of fun, and lots of other bands played too. I think the cool thing about that was we were coming up at like a time when, you know, the local music scene kind of, you know, comes in waves, it waxes and wanes. And I think the local music scene was kind of ascendant just at the time that like music across the board was changing. You know, grunge had come through and it killed hair metal, and there's all this more alternative stuff in the top 40 or whatever. And so I think Crossroads at the time sort of reflected that, because you had lots of bands from all around Texas that would come through and play. They had this kind of funk rock thing going. Sprawl was a band from Houston that came to play, and they were a lot of fun. It was crazy because I mean they had like full on horns, and you know Crossroads just has. It wasn't a very big room, and everyone's super crowded in and crazy and drunk, and the stage is just like 6 inches off the floor, and some poor guy had just to play a trombone in the middle of this mosh pit because people went nuts. These great Texas bands are coming through.
Yeah, I started actually in 77, over across the street, over where Kennedy's Jewelers is, and I started out to make banjos. And I started doing that a little bit, and I got inundated with repair, and people that just sort of fell into place, and people started bringing me instruments either to, you want to buy this or trade it in for this or that, and it just sort of within a year and a half, it turned into a little store. Over there, we started the jam sessions. Actually, we were doing them over there in 77, first week, and we always did that on Saturday. And originally, we did it all day long on Saturday. But we had people kind of staggering in, coming here and there, and they said, when's anybody get here? I'm going to go back out for coffee. So we set it up for the afternoon, and it eventually kind of drifted and found its way into where it is now. So, and that's changed so much over the years. We've had, we were really strong bluegrass for a while, and then we had a lot of music of what I think just old time country people, fiddlers and stuff from the area. I had a really good dose of that. That was one of the coolest things when I think I mentioned that in the Money Angelina deal, but I just met so many people and had so many people hanging around here all the time that were old-time fiddlers. And I remember one guy, Mr. Simmons, I'd be back here repairing fiddles, and he'd come back and fall asleep in his chair every afternoon. And I'd have these people come in, they swapping a bag of corn or peanuts for a fiddle string, and it was really cool because that really helped me feel a part of a whole nother world. In fact, those people for years became almost more my daily companions and my friends, and I felt more of them than my younger friends. I saw my younger friends a little less often, more on the weekends or here and there, but I saw these old timers every day, all day. And so that kind of changed my whole way of thinking. Somehow, and I can't say exactly how or why, I just think the way you talk and think and the little things you pick up on, what they talked about all the time, farming things and whatever. It changed you.
Well, there's a place in East Texas where the people are so grand.
That's a good question.
A pretty little place called
Bumpin' Frog. Better song.
Yes, that's where.
Yeah.
I don't know, Bumpin' Frog is a banger. It sticks in your head. I mean, it's just...
Boom, 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 boom. It had a good bass line. It had that bass line.
Look at him bump now.
You can't get that bass line out of your head, man. It's impossible.
I went walking to the pond one day when a little green frog got in my way.
You cannot keep from moving to that song. It's the silly, kind of poorly recorded, quick one-off niche thing, but man, it still gets me going. Nacogdoches, of course, is a classic. It's how a lot of people learn to spell the town. I always thought the Mickey Mouse song worked better for that. Nacogdoches, but Nacogdoches, yes, works pretty good too. That's a classic. I'm glad I still have that on 45 somewhere. But no, Bumpin' Frog is a banger.
The Bumpin' Frog it should have been the A side. Yeah, exactly. Like Rain with the Beatles. Yeah, exactly. That's it. And I had the little. We're changing gears here now. This is Tom Baker that did this song. Had Nacogdoches on one side and Bumpin' Frog on the other side. I I mowed his yard when I was a kid, and I did it for music. He was the director, the general manager at the best FM station in Nacogdoches. Played all the good stuff, you know, Pink Floyd and all that stuff back in the 70s. And he would give me albums, and I would mow his yard, and he'd give me albums, and free passes to movies and things like that. But he had that little single, and I wore that single out. But I didn't. If you'd have looked at my single, if you flipped it over, Bumpin' Frog was the one where all the vinyl was worn down. That was the one. I think he got those background singers off of Hee-Haw or something. I think. Yeah. But he would. I would come into the house after I mowed his yard, and he would play stuff, and he would play me up. He would have his guitar, his bass guitar. I mostly remember him playing bass guitar, and he would play other songs that he wrote, and he was the first musician I think I knew in Nacogdoches. I think that's true.
There was a guy named Scott Berry that was the drummer for the reggae band Uprising that morphed into Zion Lion. Well, he was the brother of Lowell Berry, was his brother, and he played piano with the guitar player in Biff Bobby and the Biffettes, Park Smith, who passed away in 2005. So the Uprising and Zion Lion actually had a link to Biff Bobby and the Biffettes, my dad's band from the 80s, because Park Smith was in a band with Lowell and Scott Berry called Punch. And they had one recorded album called Punch Music that they recorded at Rosewood and Tyler, the same studio where Austin Deptula worked at.
I walked into Hastings one day and ran into Park, who played guitar in Biff Bobby and the Biffettes, and we got to talking, and he knew that I knew Biff Bobby, but he said, well, there's this other band in town, you really got to check them out, they're pretty good, they're called Rise and Run. And I laughed, because that was me, of course, that was my band, and I told him, well, that's me, and we became fast friends, of course, after that. Me and Park were good friends. Here's the story of Rise and Run. We just decided to be a band. We liked music. We wanted to meet girls. So, Rise and Run's over with already. That's about how fast it... There were three of us primarily, me, my best friend Brad Busby, and my girlfriend at the time, Melanie, and Todd Busby was the fourth member. But I wrote songs with Melanie, and then I wrote songs with Brad, and then we wrote some, the three of us. So we were doing what we thought bands did. I mean, we were. I've always said we didn't know better. We didn't know what we were supposed to do, so we did what we saw the bands do on TV, on REM and early, I can't remember who we were listening to, maybe early U2 at that point. It seemed like it was just us and Biff Bobby and the Biffettes. After a while, I know there was a Cold Shot, the blues band called Cold Shot, Sex and Cigarettes, and some other bands started coming around. I gotta lubricate the. We actually recorded our first album, and it was all original music in 1986. The next year, or maybe that very year, we got invited to play the very first South by Southwest, for the very first one. Of course, we were a bunch of kids. We didn't have any way to get there. I mean, we weren't ill prepared. We were talking about ill prepared. That we were ill prepared, and we turned them down. Of course, nobody knew what South by Southwest was at that point. So I mean, it's like, well, let's turn these guys down. Maybe they'll come back and ask us next year, and they never did, of course.
So it's kind of cool to realize that bands and performers and stuff have been coming here for years and years, but as a kid you kind of have that solipsism of youth that, you know, everything started, you know, when you were born. So my kind of cultural consciousness of, you know, East Texas and the music scene or whatever developed in the 80s. I was aware of, you know, cover bands like Biff Botany and the Biffettes, Grady's dad, those guys. You know, I knew that they existed and they were there to serve a purpose, but, you know, I was always more interested in, you know, like the original music kind of band. And and it didn't seem really that was something you saw a lot of around here. So this was in high school. That's why it was very impressive to me, impressed upon me. When I first heard about Rise and Run and Tim's band, I remember I was in the newspaper room, I think, and it was, I think, Matt Ball, if I remember correctly. I think his older brother or somebody had a connection to those, you know, the Rise and Run guys, and so he had like a couple of their new cassette tapes that they had just recorded, and he was selling them. I think, if I remember correctly, he was a young entrepreneur. So I bought one of the Rise and Run cassettes, and I was very impressed. It was cool. It was, you know, original music, well-written songs, well recorded. It was ambitious, and it meant a lot to me that it was a local band. You know, always been a shop local dude.
So I've been able to have a career based in Nacogdoches, although I was in New Orleans for a couple of years, but mostly I've been based in Nacogdoches, and even being based here, I've had people like Mike Scott from the Water Boys, you know, kind of help out, and Steve Wickham and Liam from Hot House Flowers sang and played on the last one. So, you know, we've been able to do some cool things, some things that you wouldn't expect. You know, in 1986, when we started our first album, we would have, maybe we were shooting for the stars at that point, because, you know, we were playing, you know, the only way we knew how to do it. We ended up playing with a lot of the people that we had posters of on our walls in our practice rooms.
And it's weird now to think back, because I'm sure it happened more than once. I'd be in my room, you know, reading or writing bad poetry or whatever, and I'm sure I put in the Rise and Run cassette and listened to it, and then I probably popped on, you know, my Alarm record and listened to that, and then I probably put in, you know, a Hot House Flowers CD that I think was actually yours, but I stole from you. But it's weird because now to think back that Tim, you know, over the course of his career has played with the guy from the Alarm, and he's recorded with and is connected with, you know, the guy from Hot House Flowers. I mean, it's kind of strange to me at the time. I guess I had a type, you know, and Tim was my type, so I was a big supporter of him from the get-go.
And like the Alarm, some members, Dave Sharp of the Alarm, I went down to New Orleans to play with him for 2 or 3 years, and he's played on 1 or 2 tracks of mine since then too. So yeah, there was no Nacogdoches sound, there was no scene, there was no sound. So we were just free to be whatever we wanted to be. And I think it made us better, because, I mean, we weren't like, well, this is what we're supposed to sound like.
But Rise and Run made it reasonable for me to believe that, you know, that there was a original music band, original song band could exist here in Nacogdoches.
Every band that we tried to sound like were bands we heard on. We had their vinyl, or we had their videos. We were watching their videos on Friday Night Videos or Night Flight or whatever was showing videos back in those days. You know, we were kind of like Spinal Tap. We had a series of drummers. Our drummers didn't always explode; they imploded. But like we had one drummer that we practiced for a month or 2. Got ready, and then went to play at Yamo's, which was a bar, and all of a sudden he said, "Oh, I can't play bars. I don't believe in playing bars." Yeah, why didn't you bring that up about like 2 months ago? first thing Rise and Run ever did was go into the studio with 10 or 9 original songs and record an album. So we were doing that from the very beginning. We didn't know any better. Why put a band together if you're not going to make an album? We had no idea that most bands were cover bands and just played bars for tips. That never entered our minds at all. I think later in the 90s we played bars, but even then we played mostly original music. We would play Yamos, and even the covers that we did, the covers we played were so obscure that nobody knew they were covers. They couldn't pick our covers from our originals. Well, we started Out of the Way Cafe and Music Hall in the mid-90s. Basically, it was a cafe in the daytime and a music hall at night. And my band, Rise and Run, was kind of the house band there for a while. And then Helicopters came in and they played a lot there. We had different people kind of as house band. They were house band for a while. And we had different people. I mean, it wasn't just us, but, it was a place for local bands and musicians to play. Yeah, the first time I ever heard Country Willie was on that stage. He just came walking in. It was on a Tuesday night. Tuesday night was open mic night. And the main thing I remember about that is there wasn't a big crowd there. And what crowd there weren't many musicians in the crowd. So we had this rule that you could only do 3 songs because some people would get up there and just play past their expiration date. So we had a 3-song limit, and then you had to get off and let it circulate. So that night he came in, and there weren't many people in there, and he got up and just blew the house down. Seriously, I mean, I always tell this, Willie was as good the first time I saw him as he is now. I don't mean it in a bad way. He didn't progress. He was just always great. He was just always great.
And Country Willie was always, I mean, when you have the benefit of living here and seeing, the music scene kind of comes in, like I said, it comes in waves, and it gets fun, and then it's not so cool and it's not as fun. But there's always, Willie's always been a part of it for like a couple decades now, and he's just a workhorse, and I've seen that guy play live. He's always been super impressive. He was he's been a mainstay here in the scene musically, and also became a movie star. That was pretty cool.
Gonna see the Martian planet.
They can be the smartest persons on Earth, but you just don't send stuff to space using the number 13. Till they get that through their mind, they can't have a good space program.
He's just amazing because he's like the real deal. He was legitimate, He just grew up playing in the church, and he has, I talked to him about it one time, and it's all grew up around a bunch of relatives. They were all much older than him. He was always the youngest person there by a couple decades, and you can kind of tell by his style and his music, but it resonates with me. It's kind of what I heard growing up. So. But he can do, he can do loud punk rock screaming stuff if he wants to. But I think his heart is in the country music, and he does it really, really well. He's got an amazing, unique voice. It's astounding the sounds that come out of him.
I think he's gotten better at songwriting, maybe, because he had a song called Cardboard Guitar. I remember that. He sang, I got a cardboard guitar. And he did his 3 songs, and nobody let him off the stage. I mean, I think he did like 10 or 12 songs that night. Because, he was just so good, and everybody knew he was that good. And nobody wanted him to go off the stage. So. And that was the first time I think anybody in Nacogdoches had really heard Country Willie. Sneaky Pete played there a lot. Yeah, he was one of our regulars. Sneaky Pete, John Sitton was his name. He went by Sneaky Pete. A lot of people know him as John Sitton, but I call him Sneaky Pete. And he was great. I mean, he hung out there at our place a lot, even when he wasn't singing. But he did get up and sing a lot. Me and him got up and sang together. We had 2 or 3 songs that we did together, and he was a good friend, good guy, man, just a great guy.
Take off down the highway towards the piney woods. Tomorrow might be.
Oh.
And you can look at me. You can look at me over here. What's
I
your
can look
name?
at you.
Yeah.
My name?
Yeah.
My name. I'm Grady at Twin Creek Audio.
Sweet.
I'm a guy with the studio. I know like 2001, I was working at Jitterbugs, and that Stroking was played every night by the DJ at Jitterbugs, as well as Back in Black. Gravity Raincoat lasted from like roughly 89 to 91. So Gravity Raincoat was still a thing until 91, well, 89 and 90 mostly. And at some point in 91, we called it quits. First one we did in the barn on the 4-track was It Is Easier to Walk, an EP. And then the second one was Psych. And partway through doing Psych, we actually added Ty Newman to the band on guitar. And then later, after Psych came out, we sold copies of both of these to our friends at school on cassettes that we dubbed off. And Heath bought one.
There are times when the weight of the world holds me down, and I can't move.
And then I did the Phonetics with Austin Deptula, who's Austin's done really well in the music industry. And we did a cassette that we released called Serendipity. We recorded parts of that at Austin's house, which is on Parker Street, was in Nacogdoches. Yeah. And so we'd start out there and record keyboard tracks and like bass with the sequencer and dump that onto a cassette with a real high quality, like a best cassette we could get, and we borrowed my dad's real expensive Denon cassette deck. And so we'd run the mixes and stuff off onto the cassette, and then we would come over to Lufkin, and Austin had done some political campaign commercials for Charlie Wilson. And Charlie Wilson had a studio in downtown Lufkin. It was a Tascam 8-track and a little Tascam board. And so we would take the cassette we made at Austin's house and dump that stereo track onto the first 2 tracks of the 8-track and then overdub guitars and vocals and everything there. We'll go to the 80s first, because no, we're done with the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, the first thing in the 90s that I was involved with is after the Phonetics thing with Austin Deptula ended. That was when Brian Turnage and I started talking on the phone, and we decided we wanted to start a band. And we called Jay, who was going to college in Georgetown at the time. And Jay would come into town on weekends to play music with Brian and myself. And we got Brad Chandler originally was the drummer, and we started the Mayhaw Prophets just in time for the first, was it Nacapalooza? I remember the band Deep Blue Something actually was the headline, but at the time they were called Leper Messiah. They hadn't changed their name to Deep Blue Something, but they played the song Breakfast at Tiffany's at Breakfast at Tiffany's.
Breakfast
at
at Tiffany's by Leper Messiah.
Yeah, but they were called Leper Messiah, and it was really cool. And then the Beefmasters played. Mm-hmm. And then the new band that Brian and myself and Jay and Brad Chandler had formed, we played too, but for that gig we didn't have the name Mayhaw Prophets yet. We used a different name, like Junk Soul or something. I can't remember what it was. And then that was the first gig we ever played. And that was the years we started playing, but we played places like Headliner, Sports Bar, We played Nacogdoches when it was at the Expo Center. We played at Yamos. I left to go to audio engineering school in Phoenix in 1996. And so Mayhaw Prophets, we didn't break up, but we took a little bit of a break. And then whenever I came back to East Texas after college, we kind of briefly reformed. We never really got off the ground with that. But we did reunite in 2001 at the 10 Acre Jam.
Had the bars. That was cool. At the time, that wanted to let people play. People wanted to play it. But also, it wasn't enough to really sustain a scene. So there was a lot of DIY action going on, a lot of play in people's backyards and out in the woods. The 10 Acre Jam thing that Matt guy did was always a lot of fun. And that's such a huge undertaking. I don't know if people really appreciate how much work goes into putting something like that on. That was always cool. Before the band, my perception of the local music scene, and there was, while I was in the band as an active participant, and then after that, I was a journalist, I guess you could say, trying to promote music and document it and, kind of review, critique, whatever. Just wanted to, I was an active kind of participant in that way after the band was over. I went to my freshman year of college in Oklahoma City, and I came back to town. And Matt Wofford and Richard Newton and Brad Woodard all lived in a house on Walker Street together, and so they were always messing around, jamming and stuff. Drag the amps out into the living room and play around. A bunch of people hanging out, and it was me and Richard and Matt, and because that's what stereo was, we were changing music or whatever, and they were talking about, okay, so we got a drummer now, we just need to find someone who can be a singer. And Matt was like, Kendall can try it. And I was like, oh, never thought about it, but sure. And Richard's like, can you sing? And, I don't really know. And for the record, I can't. I'm terrible. I'm not going to lie. But I sang along to some Nirvana song or something. And it's like, okay, cool. We'll give you a shot. So we started practicing upstairs in that Walker Street house, which was Richard's bedroom, and I can't remember exactly how we did it, but we managed to get 2 guitar players, a bass player, and a drummer set up in that bedroom, and then I would go in the bathroom, and because it wasn't a lot of room for me to sing, and had this crappy old microphone that didn't work well, and so they would be in the other room playing their loud, electrified instruments loudly. And I wouldn't be able to be heard, so they'd yell, sing louder, and so I developed my technique of just yelling as loud as possible.
Well, I think the Beefmasters were just like us. We were a lot different in a lot of ways, but they were like us in the fact that they put a band together and they started writing original songs. I don't think they ever had an era where they just did covers. They were never a cover band. Did they learn? Most bands learn by playing other people's songs. They learn by playing like Wild Thing and dun, 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 and then they learn to play their own, write their own stuff. Anyway, the Beefmasters, I don't think they played other people. I think they were like us in the way that they put a band together so that they could write and do their own thing. And that's what we always loved about Beefmasters. When they came around, they, I guess, were younger than us, but they seemed smarter than us, and we learned a lot from them. We would go watch them like at Crossroads and take notes, because they did what we wanted to do. We put a band together and we thought big, and we went out on the stage and we weren't thinking about being some small band in Nacogdoches. We stormed the stage like we were, it. Like we were worth listening to. And Beefmasters did that same thing, but they took it a step further. They had a light show and an image. I don't think we ever really had an image. They thought more visually than we did. But we learned a lot from them. It's like, oh my, they were the first band that came along after us, I think, that we were like, oh, watch these guys, because we're gonna learn something from these guys. And we did.
It's fun to be a band, but we wanted that extra hook, and we really liked the Butthole Surfers. So we set up a kind of a film light show thing, and Pat and Casey started doing all that, and it got increasingly more extravagant and impressive. So he was like the sixth member, and then Steve McLean eventually took over as managing duties by virtue of having the only door in the house that locked. We had to hide the band business phone in there so other guys wouldn't break in and make long distance calls or whatever. So by virtue of having that, he was a manager, and he became like the seventh member. First show was in Matt Wofford's parents' yard, and it was in the middle of the afternoon on a Saturday. It was kind of a trial run. I got a little liquid couragey, but I think it worked in my favor because like I said, I'm not a very good singer at all, but I was willing to make a fool of myself. It's like, I will be a spectacle if we need a spectacle. So I jumped around and acted a fool, and it worked out. They seemed to be impressed. They never told me to leave, and I gave them every chance. After the grunge thing kind of kicked off in Seattle, people were making a lot of money off that. A lot of record labels started sniffing around Dallas. Well, I think Interscope put a lot of money into Dallas. So you had all these bands like Hagfish and Deep Blue Something, and the Toadies had just gotten popular, and Tripping Daisy was coming to town, and so they would all come through town too, because they all had records to promote and advances to pay back, so they were playing everywhere. I remember one time Deep Blue Something was supposed to play, and they canceled, and so the guys at Crossroads called us up to see if we'd fill in, It's like, okay, sure, we'll take any opportunity to play. And it's so funny because we were loading our stuff in through this little side door right behind the stage. And some people come popping up and they're like, hey, is Deep Blue Something here? And it's like, no, sorry, they canceled, we're playing. And like, oh, darn. And they turn around and walked off. We're like, oh, sorry to disappoint you.
Leper Messiah, also known as Deep Blue Something now.
After Crossroads closed, had to find different places to play. And so we started playing around town, and it was cool because, like I said, the local scene was kind of ascendant. There was a lot of places to play. You had Crossroads, of course, and Bullwinkles, but there was Yamos, and I remember seeing. It wasn't just always bands. There was a lot of singer-songwriters. I remember seeing Andy Schote and Jimmy Smith, the guy from the Gourds, doing a show at Yakafritz, the sandwich shop downtown. And I had to put the stage, they had this little stage they put down, but it blocked the front door, so everyone had to go in the back door in this little bitty narrow sandwich shop. But it was a really good show. I remember that show very well. It was a great time. I think by virtue of age, we were the first of a bunch of bands that played around that time. But Clutch Cargo was real good, and I think Alex from that band is the other band in Seattle now, the Detonators. He's still rocking and rolling. Now, Gunny Sack was another band that was super cool. Now, if you catch me in a certain mood, I'll make the long and incoherent argument that they were the greatest band in this town ever.
Beefmasters is probably the second best band. Kendall, don't get mad at me, just by a little bit. My favorite band I ever heard in Nacogdoches were Helicopter.
We turned down the opportunity to open for Candlebox. And it was a good opportunity, and we probably should have done it, but we already had another show booked, and we wanted to be professional, and plus we just didn't like Candlebox so much, so we turned them down. We got to open for a band called the Chainsaw Kittens, who I saw open for Jane's Addiction in Oklahoma City. So they weren't very popular, and there weren't a lot of people there, but I had that little 6 degrees of separation moment there. We were lucky in that we had a lot of bars to play at, a lot of bands trying to play at those places. One kind of makes the other go around. Kind of adopted Houston as our home base as far as big city is concerned. So we had a lot of bands there we played with. We played with Bleach Bath, I think probably the most. They were pretty cool guys. We played with this band called 30 Foot Fall. We played a lot of shows with them. So we recorded an album, Secret Place of Wonderment, there in Houston. Kind of had to do it in small chunks. Drive down to Houston, record a little bit, and set up some time and go back and do it again. Nathan Jones, our drummer, his parents were Mickey and Jim. They were very supportive. They hooked us up with the people who somehow they were connected with this recording studio in San Antonio, and they hooked us up with them. Recorded that there in San Antonio. We actually met Henry Thomas, the kid from E.T. He showed up one day. We didn't know who he was until after it was over. I think Richard tried to give him some fries or something. Ended up playing our last show at, I think it's Sport Shack. Steve was managing there. And that's pretty much into it until we did the reunion thing a few years ago for Brad's birthday.
And in Kendall, we were playing Luke Perry, and Kendall had a little Teen Beat picture of Luke Perry that he set on fire. And it made it.
You haven't been out to Tracy Mercy's for the Halloween thing.
130 on stage for like a minute.
You've never been out there before.
And it was like
it's just a big tin shell.
Yeah, those were the days.
Yeah, after we ended, I think Brad went on to play in El Cabong.
So yeah, I was on my own, and I started calling up my friends, and I started hanging out with Brendan Rogers and Jay Anderson all the time, and the three of us hatched the idea to start a kind of funk rock band that would be a lot of fun and kind of lighthearted. And it was actually, I can't remember whose idea it was. It may have been Brendan's idea to ask Brad, who were from the Beefmasters, to join the band. Yeah, but as soon as they mentioned that, I was like, yeah. Because Brad and I, back when he was in Beefmasters and I was in Mayhaw Prophets, I was over at his apartment. We'd play guitar and talk shop and hang out a lot. And so I knew Brad already. I was like, yeah, get Brad in the band. Actually sounds pretty good for the fact that I had anything to work with back in much. But the second one we did out at the cabin, and we also did it was done on tape. Yeah, we did that on a 16 track on analog tape. And that was the same place where we recorded the Country Willie and the Cosmic Debris material that actually, they used a lot of that in the movie, Rainbow's End movie. In fact, the live performances where they show Country Willie and Cosmic Debris playing, what you hear is actually the studio recordings, because, I mean, I'm sure they probably didn't get a great recording on top, playing on top of the school bus. It's a great movie, by the way. If you have not seen that movie, you got to see Rainbow's End. Excellent. I have the DVD because it's hard to find, and no, you can't borrow it. I joined ETX Binary System, which was, I only was with them for about a year and a half, and that was in 2013, 2014. And we played that one. We played all over. We played on 6th Street in Austin at the Red Eyed Fly. We played at Lake Charles, Louisiana. We played in Nacogdoches and Lufkin a few times. We played at like Wild Willie's in Lufkin. And I don't remember where, Macklemore's. Yeah, we played at several local gigs. But yeah, that was a cool band because it was 2 people from Nacogdoches and 2 people from Lufkin. And so we were at ETX Binary System, I'm guessing because of Lufkin and Nacogdoches, like a binary star system, and half the band was in Newtown. I don't know. But that was fun. That was actually a whole lot of fun.
Well, the Americana Fest were great. They picked the right person. Red River Radio approached John Andy and said, "What kind of festival do you want to have?" And he was like, "Americana. Nobody else is doing that." So that brought Texas bands, the old 97s, Guy Clark, Ray Wiley Hubbard, Eliza Gilkison, the Gourds.
One of the really interesting things, and we should all know this from commercial music, that it never stops changing. You know, I mean, all my life it's been changing, but we tend to think of traditional music as being traditional music, and it's the same. It's changed. It's changed slower. It's changed. We still do a lot of the same tunes, but the abilities of people and the accessibility of learning and the development of tunes changes them. People play certain fiddle tunes and such now. They've metamorphosized, you know, over the years. I can see a gigantic difference between now and when I started over 40 years ago. What old-time fiddlers played then, their repertoire in general has changed hugely. There's tunes like Sally Gooden and stuff, you know, that are still there, and they always were, and they probably always will be. But even them, if probably there's always some new kid who's adding a little more hot licks, you know, whatever. It's going some direction, or in the opposite direction. In recent years, old-time music in the more pure forms has exploded in popularity. So what they've done with that is they've made more complex another style of the same music, and that's the old, what we call old-time music now. What I think of as old-time music like that, you know, clawhammer, banjo, and fiddle has gotten like, I mean, we've got people now, a number of people that are like Juilliard level people playing that music, and they're taking it to other levels, but they don't sound flashy. But if you listen to them, you hear nuances like crazy. It's like, man, they're doing little bitty things in there. They're taking this art, and without getting radical in their changes, they're doing radical things because they can, that you barely notice. It just sounds better.
You know, we've been on and off and on and off, and more off than on. But you know, we recorded an album just in 2016. Came back together after 20 years apart and did a new Rise and Run album. So, you know, I think there will probably be another one before the next year or so. We'll probably do another one. So,
Nacogdoches has always been like one of these vortexes or lines that cross. That's been a deep well, in my opinion, of socializing, happenings, art, music. That's, you know, still carries, you know, quite a lot of weight to the locals.
The point of that is that East Texas, you know, especially then, and I think now too, probably, but especially then, was alive with music. In the 50s and in the 60s, you know, it was there, even though people don't think of East Texas as being like the shining place for, you know, music.
You know, once I quit the paper and kind of got turned into a grumpy old man, I stopped paying as much attention to, you know, the music scene. Now there's still lots of stuff happening, you know, but it's cool. It's so cool to see, you know, flyers up and go, I don't know any of those bands, but there's a lot of them, and I bet they're all having a really good time. I hope they are. So it's cool to know that stuff carries on, even though you stop paying attention to it.
You know, I've got a lot of respect for the musicians in East Texas because we've got really good ones. It's just, you know, it's something that more people should know about.
No, I mean, it continues. I mean, yeah. Nacogdoches tried forever. Yep.
Used to be so beautiful. In every single way. All is quite atrocious. Showing up on my porch with the sack of roaches, looking for some refuges the night encroaches. You just need a place to chill and all roads lead to Garrison, Henderson, Bravo, Blair, Redcross, Sackle, Park, and Crockett. I guess that you think it's up, but all roads lead to Houski, Cleveland, Corgan, Lufkin, Elko, Gilmore, Ruskin, Cushing, Texas, Tennessee.
Close enough for